Imagine, if you will, the sound of 1,000 men, all sailors, all hardened against the world's unpredictable violence, weeping on the shoreline. It is March 24, 1878, and the UK is a nation defined by its navy. Britain's power, its wealth, and its very identity are bound up in the wooden and iron hulls that rule the waves. The Royal Navy is not just a military force, it is a sacred trust, a guarantor of peace and empire. Yet, on this unseasonably warm Sunday afternoon, the sea, the nation's greatest ally, had suddenly, savagely become its most treacherous foe. The disaster that unfolded in the sheltered waters of the Solent, the narrow, mile-wide strait that separates the Isle of Wight from the mainland, was so swift, so complete, and so utterly bizarre that it would rattle the British public's faith in its own mastery of the oceans for years to come. It was the vanishing of the HMS Eurydice. Part 1. The Ill-Fated Voyage. The Eurydice was not a battleship, but a graceful, three-masted, square-rigged sailing frigate. Originally built in 1843, she had been recommissioned in 1877 as a training ship, a sea school for young naval volunteers. Her very purpose was to teach the next generation of sailors how to master the old ways of sail before they moved on to the new, formidable ironclads. She was a link to a romantic, glorious past, commanded by Captain Marcus Hare, a respected officer of 30 years' service, and crewed by a total of 319 men and boys. Most of them were young, eager, and from respectable working and middle-class families across the UK. For many, this was their first real time away from home. The voyage was nearing its end. The Eurydice had just completed a 4-month training cruise to the West Indies and the Azores. The boys had seen the tropics, crossed the Atlantic, and returned hardened, tanned, and ready to tell their families tales of adventure. On the morning of Sunday, March 24th, the frigate was within sight of Portsmouth and the anchorage that awaited her. They were home. The weather had been fine all day. The sun was shining on the Solent, and other smaller vessels dotted the calm waters. The air was soft. So calm was the day that many of the young sailors had been permitted to bring up their belongings from below to air them out, a final gesture of domesticity before the rigorous procedures of docking began. The frigate was under full sail, a magnificent sight, a towering white canvas structure moving with a steady, purposeful grace toward Spithead. The White Squall. The extraordinary, inexplicable shift in the weather began just before 4 p.m. A colossal dark gray cloud bank appeared suddenly over the western ridge of the Isle of Wight, moving with incredible speed. It was a weather phenomenon known as a white squall, a powerful, sudden gust of wind, often accompanied by sleet or snow, that hits with the force of a hurricane, giving almost no warning. Captain Hare, a man of profound experience, spotted the danger instantly. He knew the risk of a full-rigged ship in such a sudden tempest. He bellowed the order, "Clew up and down." This command meant to haul up the sails and drop the massive yards to reduce the wind's purchase on the ship's structure. The young crew, trained to perfection, leapt into action, scaling the rigging to furl the sails. But the Eurydice was too close to home. Her sails were too vast, her momentum too great. The squall struck her with a shocking violence that transcended all expectation. The eyewitness accounts from nearby vessels were terrifyingly consistent. The snow was so thick it turned the air opaque, and the wind slammed into the ship's massive canvas side on. The effect was immediate. The ship was heeled over sharply onto her beam ends. The angle was so severe that the lower rows of gun ports, which had been opened to ventilate the air below deck, dipped below the waterline. The sea poured in, not in waves, but in a solid, continuous sheet. The vanishing. What followed was not a drawn-out naval engagement or a slow theatrical sinking. It was a drowning in an instant. The immense weight of the water that surged through the open gun ports was enough to overwhelm the ship's buoyancy. Captain Hare, standing on the weather side of the quarterdeck, saw his homebound ship vanish. It took less than 8 minutes from the moment the first snowflake fell to the complete submersion of the Eurydice. She went down so fast that the hundreds of men below deck, those airing their clothes or preparing for their first night home, had no chance. Many were trapped below, likely asphyxiated by the sudden rush of water and air pressure. Of the 319 souls on board, only 2 survived: Ordinary Seaman Benjamin Ferris and stoker Thomas Flanagan. Their accounts were harrowing. Ferris, on deck and thrown clear, described the ship simply going. Flanagan, miraculously thrown up a hatchway by the rushing water, recalled seeing Captain Hare clinging to the rigging, shouting, "It's all over, lads! Save yourselves!" A final, heroic, and utterly useless command against a force of nature. Hare, an officer of the old school, went down with his ship. The news hit the British public like a physical blow. A naval disaster was expected in the far-flung colonies or in the heat of battle, not 150 yards off the beautiful, serene shores of the Isle of Wight, in peacetime, within sight of home. The national grief was intense, personal, and profound. Part 2. The Morbid Quest. The sinking of the Eurydice immediately morphed from a naval tragedy into a national obsession, an almost morbid quest to reclaim the dead and the symbol of the ship itself. The Victorian era was steeped in a mixture of religious piety, romanticism, and a fascination with death and the macabre. The idea of 317 young, brave men, the flower of the fleet, resting in an unmarked, watery grave within sight of the coast was intolerable. The Admiralty, under immense public and political pressure, committed to raising the ship, not for salvage, but for reverence and repatriation. What followed was one of the most remarkable and harrowing deep-sea salvage operations of the 19th century. The Eurydice lay in 66 feet of water, upright, with her mastheads just breaking the surface at low tide, a chilling maritime tombstone. The salvage efforts were led by Captain Frederick L. Matthews of the Royal Engineers, a task that required not only incredible engineering ingenuity, but also a horrifying daily encounter with the dead. The Army of the Deep. For the next 4 months, an Army of the Deep was assembled. The work was done by divers from the Royal Engineers and the Royal Navy, wearing the heavy, copper-helmeted standard diving dress. These men descended daily into the cold, dark hull, where time had stopped on the afternoon of March 24th. The conditions were appalling. The ship was a scene of perfect, petrified chaos. Everything inside, from hammocks to books, musical instruments, and the boys' personal effects, was perfectly preserved, but saturated and coated in a thick, oily silt. The divers had to grope their way through cabins, mess halls, and gangways, often working by touch alone in the gloam. But the most difficult, emotionally shattering task was the retrieval of the bodies. The young men were found exactly where they had been when the squall hit. Many were still sitting at tables waiting for tea. Others were found in their hammocks, having gone down for an afternoon nap. The bodies of Captain Hare and his first lieutenant were found on the quarterdeck, exactly where they had stood their ground. The salvage was not an engineering feat. It was a mass, painstaking recovery of the drowned. Each body was carefully brought up, placed in a temporary coffin on a nearby barge, and given over to the waiting undertakers and the families who had descended on Portsmouth from every corner of the United Kingdom. The scene at Portsmouth Dockyard became a daily macabre ritual. A continuous queue of mourning families, draped in the heavy black crepe of Victorian grief, waited for the remains of their sons. The sheer number of coffins, 317 to be precise, overwhelmed local resources. They were temporarily stored in a sail loft, the air thick with the smell of salt, oil, and death.
The final haul. The operation lasted until the end of August 1878. The effort to raise the ship involved a complex system of caissons, large watertight chambers, and floating camels, pontoons for lifting ships, designed to apply steady, massive upward pressure on the waterlogged hull. It took 3 attempts and the brute force of almost every available salvage vessel in the Solent to finally break the Eurydice free of the mud. When she was finally towed into Portsmouth Harbor, her masts broken, her sails gone, listing heavily and streaming water, she was no longer a beautiful frigate, but a mangled monument to the power of the sea. The public reaction was visceral. The Admiralty, having promised to save the ship, then made the difficult decision that she was too far gone to ever be seaworthy. The Eurydice, the proud ship that had trained hundreds of sailors, was broken up for scrap. Part 3. The Legacy of the Solent. The sinking of the HMS Eurydice remains one of the greatest peacetime tragedies in the history of the Royal Navy, and a definitive, traumatic moment in Victorian Britain. The disaster had several lasting and surprising effects. 1. Naval design and open ports. The most immediate technical lesson was the danger of leaving gun ports open for ventilation in a sailing vessel, especially in narrow waters like the Solent. This tragedy contributed to significant changes in procedures and ship design, ensuring that future vessels had more robust and secure ways to ventilate the lower decks. 2. The rise of the training ship. The loss of so many young men, many of whom were from affluent families, led to a public questioning of the traditional methods of naval training. While the value of square-rig sailing was understood, the immense risk was now painfully clear. The tragedy sped up the transition to steam-powered training vessels, arguing that the life of a young man should not be risked to a romantic anachronism. 3. The Ghost of the Solent. The wreck site and the story itself became woven into the folklore of the South Coast. Local boatmen and fishermen would long tell tales of the Eurydice weather, the sudden, deadly squalls that could appear from nowhere. The wreck itself, though mostly removed, still has pieces lying on the seabed, a somber reminder of the unexpected brutality of the English Channel. 4. A national monument. The lasting tribute is perhaps the most significant. The great majority of the dead were eventually buried in a mass grave in the churchyard of St. Paul's, East Southsea, near Portsmouth. A large granite memorial, known as the Eurydice Memorial, was erected there, a perpetual testament to the 317 lives lost. It remains a place of pilgrimage for those who understand the true cost of Britain's mastery of the sea. The story of the Eurydice is not just a tale of a sinking ship. It is a profound historical snapshot of Victorian Britain. It illustrates the era's deep bond with the ocean, its pride in the Navy, its almost unbelievable dedication to the ceremonial recovery of the dead, and the devastating speed with which a benign world could turn lethal. It shows that even at the height of the British Empire's power, the forces of nature, particularly the capricious power of the sea that gave the nation its strength, could still claim their sacrifice right on the doorstep of home. The squall that sank the Eurydice was a momentary white curtain, a few minutes of snow and wind. But behind that curtain, 317 families lost their sons, and a nation was forced to confront the true, terrifying fragility that lay beneath the veneer of its imperial confidence.